Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Questine here with a discussion about the races of Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires that are most in need of a rework. Now, the listing here is based on the votes and the polls that I've done, though I do agree with the choices that people have picked. Though, of course, there's also certain races that I do feel need a rework that a lot of people don't particularly care much about. You can think about High Elves, you can think about Dark Elves. Specifically with Dark Elves, the uniqueness of campaigns as opposed to the race in itself. So like Malekith, Morathi, Hellebrand, etc. With High Elves, it is more of a racial aspect as opposed to a campaign situation, though certainly Tyrion and Teclis could use more unique mechanics. But anyway, let's talk about the Lizardmen. The Lizardmen do suffer from a large number of issues, and they certainly haven't made the translation well from Warhammer 2 to Warhammer 3. In fact, many people would dare argue that they weren't particularly great in Warhammer 2 either, despite the fact that they got a bunch of content, free content, paid content. Regardless of that, they certainly have been left behind as a race. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. How has Creative Assembly made a race of dinosaurs riding dinosaurs boring is astounding in quite a lot of ways. Now, one of the problems with Lizardmen is the jungle in itself. It is slow to move. And when it's slow to move through, every single campaign in the jungle, regardless of the race, does suffer from it. High Elves suffer from it. Dark Elves suffer from it. Like Rakarth has easily the worst Dark Elven campaign from my perspective because of the jungle. Not because his Lord effects or the race he's part of, just the jungle climate in of itself. Jan Bo doesn't have a great campaign because of it, so that is more of an inherent issue with the jungle. It's just slow to navigate. But you know what's weird about that? The Lizardmen, and this is no joke, the Lizardmen are one of the worst races to deal with the jungle because of the way their race works. To understand that, you need to understand a couple of things. The research tree of the Lizardmen is a mess. There's some useful things to be certain on here, like construction time for provincial capital and settlement buildings. Things like growth, things like campaign movement range, they're all tied in this research tree. The problem is that it takes 15 turns to do this kind of research, and you need various structures that aren't necessarily so easy to acquire. Then you look at other things for the Lizardmen, their growth. Now, their growth is not necessarily bad. If you look at the main settlement buildings, which are critical to growth, it is decent enough, it's reasonable enough. But the problem is, when you're conquering territory slower, which you are certainly going to do with the jungle warfare aspect, when you're conquering territory slower, you're going to build it slower. That's just the inherent nature of it. And that is going to be a problem. Also, weirdly enough, Lizardmen are one of the few races in Warhammer 3 that consistently have a control problem in their campaigns, because you build up settlements slow, because you conquer them slow, you build up settlements slow, you don't have a commandment, because, yeah, the geomantic web is not particularly great, you don't really have a commandment that gives you enough control. You get alignment of order, which is like, oh, it's useful for plagues and all that, but you only get 2 control for it. That is not good enough. Oh, you get the debuff on enemies. The problem with Lizardmen campaigns isn't the quality of those armies. If you can get an army to a fight, you're probably going to win it, assuming it is a full army, especially if Saurus. The issue is getting that army to the fight because, you know, slow movement through the jungle, slow growth, slow building of armies, and so on and so forth. Now, another problem for the Lizardmen is their slow building time, because they have a slower building time than virtually every other race in the game. I think only the Tomb Kings have a slower time, and keep in mind something about the Tomb Kings. The Tomb Kings may have a slower build time, so their early game does get affected, and their early game is not particularly great. But the Tomb Kings do have the inherent advantage that after a certain point in their campaign, they're just steamrolling everything. Free armies, free lords, lords with immortality the moment you recruit them. The only thing you actually lose in a Tomb King situation, if you lose entire armies, which you can by the way recruit very fast because every settlement it has gives you local recruitment capacity, the only thing you'll lose in a Tomb King campaign is possibly the heroes. Just remove them from an army before a battle if you think you can't win it. That is it. And you can recruit heroes anyway as the Tomb Kings, even if you have to start over. So it ends up being insignificant. Losing an army as the Lizardmen is exceptionally painful. It takes a long time to recruit, is expensive, and while you do have a good amount of XP, that is one of the few benefits that Lizardmen do have, it is just that slow path. Now, it's kind of bizarre to think about it because the Lizardmen do have a decent enough economy, but it's not particularly great. It goes up to 400, you might think that's decent. The buildings are themselves relatively cheap, right? 500 for 200, pretty reasonable. Building to increase income from all buildings in the entire province, again, pretty reasonable. But it is that slow construction time combined with the jungle warfare that leads to slow growth of settlements in general, which limits your economy, limits your options. And a lot of the options for Lizardmen are inherently limited. Also, the fact that your basic barracks takes 2 turns, your tier 2 barracks takes 3 turns, and so on and so forth, does limit your options even further. Worse, yes, worse, it's also the hero situation. See, the only hero you can get at tier 2, with the exception of Krokar, who can get Scar veterans at tier 2 and increase capacity at tier 3. But for most Lizardmen campaign, the only heroes you can get at tier 2 and increase capacity at tier 3 are Skink Chiefs, which are a meaningless hero that you only get for the sake of replenishment. Like, the actual combat ability is pointless. Like, you don't get them for any kind of combat ability. You literally only pick them up for the sake of replenishment. Everything else, you can get Skink Priests at tier 3, but you require tier 4 to increase their capacity, and then you require tier 5 to increase Oracle capacity. That is genuinely horrible. One of the worst hero situations in the game. Scar veterans, which are the training guys, which are pretty useful, they, most of the time, with the exception of Krokar, they can only be recruited at tier 4, not tier 3, tier 4, and capacity gets increased at tier 4. So while it obviously works out for Krokar, it is not a great situation for anyone else. All of this combined leads to a slower campaign pace, leads to fewer armies, means you're dealing with threats slower than other factions, and it's just not a great dynamic. Some people might be fine with a slower campaign, sure, if the pace of the game was slower. But one of the things I've stated many times, and this is fundamentally true, campaigns in Warhammer 3 are inherently dictated by the early game. In fact, they've been dictated by the early game. Like, the first 20-30 turns are what determine your success or failure. The issue for the Lizardmen isn't that they can't win campaigns. You can win the campaign as the Demon Prince. The issue is that in virtually all Lizardmen campaigns, you're doing the same thing over and over again, with the exception of, like, Tenuan and Oxyotl, to a degree, and only to a degree in Oxyotl's campaign. You get SARS, or in Tenuan's and Oxyotl's army, you get Chameleon Skinks. You spam one SARS army, and that's all you're going to afford for like 10 plus turns. And even when you get the second army, you're going to struggle to maintain that second army for about 30 turns. And it's only after turn 30 that you get really to a point where you might have the same kind of build time as other factions, because you can get, Tablet of Monuments. Which, by the way, speaking about the Tablet of Monuments, they require a tier 3 structure. Tying research to buildings is something that CA has moved away from. They should move away from it with the Lizardmen. There's other things as well over here. Let's consider heroes. They don't have a special skill line. None of them do. Not when we think about, like, Scar veterans as an example, right? Just perfect example. They can have a Scarnosaur, that's great, but they don't have a special skill line, so they have less variety than other races and their heroes. This is one of the reasons that Lizardmen do need a rework, those kind of skill lines for heroes. For Lords, this is a pretty bad situation for Lords. Basically, if you're playing any Lizardmen campaign, and I do mean any Lizardmen campaign, not just Krokar, the only Lord choice you want to go for is the Saurus Soulblood. Things like Slan Mage Priests, things like Croxicar Agents, things like Red-Crested Skinks, they're not worth recruiting. Do you know why? It ties back to the issues of recruitment and income. It's not even worth getting a Red-Crested Skink Chief for the sake of a Skink army. Do you know why that it's not worth it? Because the upkeep situation, the upkeep problem that does exist. Skink Chiefs, you might think, well, they should obviously reduce the upkeep of Skinks, right? Make that kind of playstyle worth it. They don't. They give them a bunch of benefits in combat, but they reduce upkeep for cold ones and pterodons, which you never recruit in any campaign. Oh, you get more melee benefits in combat. Like, as I said, it's not the combat issue. If you get to a full, against an enemy with a full army of Saurus, you probably will win that fight. Speaking about that, by the way, you know what's annoying? The fact that you have Saurus warriors and then Saurus warriors with shields, and it's literally the same unit, just a shield added, but you never bother with them because, like, well, same unit, just a bit more upkeep, but you don't bother with them because it takes ages to get to tier 3. So unless you're using something like the Warband upgrade mod, it's just flat out not worth it. Tying unit requiring certain structures to get certain units, like, you know, Sacred Croxgars. Again, not a great situation. Now, just removing the building requirement may not necessarily be the greatest thing, so I think CA needs to ask themselves, how do they resolve the Sacred Croxgar issue situation? How do they resolve blessed units, right? Those are the kind of problems in a Lizardmen campaign. Oxyotl is the best Lizardmen campaign for a simple reason that he doesn't have to deal with jungle at all, so he ends up being much better for it. But he still has to deal with slow construction, he still has to deal with the research tree, he has to deal with the limitations of hero capacity, so even his campaign does fall off. Also, his campaign makes the entire campaign map lag significantly, though maybe not on a high-end computer. Like, I personally just replaced my CPU into memory, and I can tell you it's a major difference. Now, you might argue, well, you can fix the construction time if you just get the Saurus Soul Blood. This is, by the way, another reason why you want to get Saurus Soul Blood, because you have the choice of a particular blessing, right? But here's the thing, not all blessings are created equally. So basically, Quetzal is your deity, and you will only worship Quetzal because all the others are pointless, with one major exception. Kotek. Kotek gives you construction time for provincial capital settlement buildings. You might think that's great, except until you remember that you only have a limited number of armies, so while it can be useful in the long term, it's not so great early on. Now, this is an inherent issue in Warhammer 3, that the game is certainly too focused on or rather the challenge of the campaign is too focused on the early game, and this has been the case in Shogun 2, really. Ever since they added Legendary, it's been the case. And not enough on the mid-late game, and it's just not interesting. If you're a veteran player, specifically, I think this is one of those dilemmas that Creative Assembly does need to ask themselves, how do we resolve this? Because the game, obviously, the research, the units, all that, they're built around longer campaigns, but that's not how the game works right now. How to resolve this going forward is going to be the big question mark. At number 4, we have Bretonnia, although number 4 question mark, because I put Bretonnia in its own poll with other races and they won hands down. However, they didn't have much real competition in that particular poll, so I'm just putting them over here in number 4, because they did get a lot of votes, but I have to consider the fact that they didn't have competition in that poll, so that's the reason they got so many votes. You could consider them higher, you could consider them lower, that's really up to you. But one thing has become very clear in all the polling that I've done, a lot of people do dislike the way Bretonnia works. The reason behind this, the reason why so many people dislike Bretonnia, surprisingly, they're the exact polar opposite of the Lizardmen. See, Lizardmen struggle because slow growth, some construction. Well, Bretonnia has the highest growth of any faction in the entire freaking game. Their basic settlements give them 20 growth. Their tier 2 settlements, 40. They can go up to 100 growth. Growth is not an issue for Bretonnia. Economy? Bretonnia may flat out have the highest money generation of any race in the entire game, because their landed estate gives them 600 income, but it gets buffed by 50% in the local region for the water wheel. While it is certainly annoying to get multiple buildings for the same effect, you don't need any other building over here, like control, meaningless. Growth, meaningless. Industry, well, it gets cancelled out by a farm. So you only need 2 economic buildings. The farm and the water wheel. And you can get rid of the water wheel once you've built the farm up, the landed estate. So Bretonnia has great growth. Control, Bretonnia has that in spades as well. Why do they have that in spades? Well, let me just take a settlement over here with Llewellyn Court, and I'll just go over this very, very quickly. See, Bretonnia has a basic commandment that gives them 10 control. You will never face a rebellion as Bretonnia. Flat out, it will never freaking happen in a Bretonian campaign. So that is a significant level of power that Bretonnia does have. From an economic standpoint, from a control standpoint, and ultimately from a construction standpoint. But what are the issues of Bretonnia? Why do people hate them? Also, it's worth pointing out, Bretonnia can recruit quite a few units, because while their main settlement buildings don't increase local recruitment capacity, they do have a commandment that does give them +2 local recruitment capacity, and they also have buildings that can increase that even further, the smithy, which you may want to get. Okay, so Bretonnia is good from the perspective of economic growth control power. Why do so many people hate them? Well, first off, Bretonnia as the territory in the campaign map is not great. Now, this wouldn't be a problem having so many settlements, minor settlements, and provincial capitals so close together. It can be very lucrative, especially for Bretonnia, because Bretonnia does actually want higher tier settlements as opposed to a bunch of minor settlements. It's mostly for the sake of recruiting their higher end units. So Bretonnia is designed well for Bretonnia because, you know, you get food squires at tier 4, that's not a problem, it's not too horrible. Here's the issue though. Confederation, aka the horrible mess that is the research tree. To get the unification of Bretonnia takes 41 turns, and you know what the horrible thing about this is? You need to do this for the sake of confederating, you know, Bordelot or Carcassonne, so you need to spend 16 turns or 26 turns for the other, and then 41, but a lot of these are pointless because these are minor factions that are going to be wiped out. The best thing you can actually do in a Bretonian campaign is ignore Bretonnia, let Kemmler, Grom, and all that take most of it, and then you can reconquer it. Because while you certainly can declare war on a Bretonian faction, there's no limitation on that, you will lose chivalry, which is a problem in the early game. So that's one issue. Like, the territory of Bretonnia, their annoyance with the research tree. Actually, the research tree gets even worse because you have water pumps. Basically, the Bretonnia research tree, when you're playing a Bretonnia campaign, nothing is anywhere near as important as getting water pumps as quickly as possible. Why? Because you may not have supply lines, but you do have the peasant economy. And the problem with the peasant economy isn't the way it affects your economy, because again, you have a lot of money. So even if your farm income goes down by a lot, that's not really the problem. The problem is, the significant problem with this is, one, it's very limited early on in a campaign. Two, your replenishment for peasants goes down the fucking drain when you're playing as Bretonian if you have too many peasants. Like, it just collapses. So actually maintaining a lot of armies early on in a Bretonian campaign is complicated because peasants won't replenish. It's not like Bretonnia has bad replenishment. They don't, actually. They have damsels who do give that replenishment, and they're very easy enough to acquire because all you need is a tier 3 settlement. You have a bunch of provincial capitals. The issue, however, is because of this, not great for peasants. Okay, why don't you just go knights? Yeah, vows. Vows exist. So every Bretonian lord, the knights themselves, when you're recruiting them, have a significant upkeep cost unless you get knights vows, questing vows, etc. It's something that's going to slow you down significantly because in order to just get, you know, basic knights, so knights errant, knights of the realm, you need to unlock the knight's vow. And then you need to unlock the questing vow to get questing knights, and then the grail vow. Now, knight's vow and grail vow are not too horrible, but it does take time. It takes multiple turns, and you have to do this on each lord individually, and you also have to do it on every single freaking hero. Which, yeah, it's not great. I mean, for heroes, it doesn't matter as much. Yes, you get a couple of benefits like Rove, cooldown, and Immortal that you could potentially get faster than, you know, Immortality at rank 20. But it isn't a great affair having to do this all the time. Because it means, like, when you're recruiting an army, you have to have a lot of money in the bank, because when you're recruiting a new army, the new lord is obviously not going to have those vows unlocked, so your upkeep is just going to be insane. You can, if you get a ridiculous amount of chivalry, get the questing vow or the knight's vow, but that requires a significant level of that requires a significant level of chivalry. So basically, Bretonnia can work in terms of vows, in terms of all that, in the long term, but early on, they're screwed. And the problem is, the significant issue is, Bretonnia has ranged infantry or anything infantry related, with the exception of foot squires and to some degree battle pilgrims, are just gonna die in droves in battle, which is not great. They just don't have great stats. Bretonnia lacks infantry. One thing people have suggested is giving the ability of mounts to dismount. Of knights to dismount. Now, the reason this is a problem with respect to infantry is not just the fact, like, okay, you know, not having units that are war for them, because you don't want to use infantry units in a Bretonian campaign, which makes your life miserable for sieges, especially, funnily enough, in actual Bretonian settlements. You'd think Bretonian settlements would be open-ended. They're not. They're tight hellholes where actually fighting with cavalry is really frustrating. And that does create problems for Lewin and the Fey Enchantress. It's better for Alberic and Rapunzel, except Alberic deals with the jungle, and, well, Rapunzel, well, she just works, but still. Only having one campaign where you don't have to deal with this annoying crap is not a great situation in your campaign.
King Lewin Leoncoeur.
And yeah, not having, like, peasant archers are not great. They will lose to virtually all other archers in the game.
By the light of the lady.
Peasant infantry, men-at-arms, etc., they will lose to Imperial freaking swordsmen and spearmen with shields. They're that bad, let alone things like great swords. Foot squires are not going to stand up to virtually anything, and we do need, people have said this, we need foot knights. Bretonnia does actually have good artillery, because trebuchets do a truckload of damage, especially against walls. So you have at least the ability of breaking down walls, but you do have that limitation of, like, not having infantry. And you might say, well, Bretonnia doesn't need infantry. Well, I'm sorry to say it, you can argue that in theory. In practice, not having good infantry, not having good range units, only having good artillery, or one good artillery option, is not good enough for the meta, because the meta of Warhammer 3 is focused on range units and infantry units. Cavalry works, but only limited quantities. Managing an entire cavalry stack, even in a field battle, is not great. You'll benefit more in a Bretonian campaign by using a mod that disables all sieges, but then the vow issue, the research issues still show up. Also, it's annoying when you do actually research a confederation over here. It's not like you just confederate these factions. No. You either have to spend chivalry, which is a precious resource that you want to do, or you have to spend a truckload of gold. I'd always go for the gold, because that's the one thing that Bretonnia apparently has in droves: money. It's not a horrible race, but it really does need improvements. Also, yeah, like with Lizardmen and other races on this list, their heroes do need special skill lines. They need those kind of choices in their campaigns to feel more unique than they currently are. That's something I would change. Change the vow system, buff the infantry, or give us the ability of buffing the infantry earlier on. You can argue, well, you can pick up a lot of armories, and that will buff up the armor of your units. Yeah, even for a fast-growing faction like Bretonnia, needing to get to tier 4 to get any kind of decent infantry, and even then getting a lot of these armories to get good infantry, is not a great dynamic in any campaign. So I would say, give us the ability of getting better infantry, make the vows far easier to unlock. Also, it's worth pointing out that the vows are really annoying to unlock in Bretonnia, because if you're in jungle or the desert, much easier to get the questing vow. Like Knight's Vow and Grail vow, the requirements are fine, though maybe a bit too much. But in terms of what they're required to do, like, oh, rank up 5 times. Sounds fine. It's fine early on. It's not so great later on. It would also be better if we could get, you know, the Knight's Vow unlocked, not at 4,000 chivalry, but like at something like 2,000 for all new lords, and questing vow like maybe 3,000. Or maybe get Knight's Vow at 1,000 chivalry, questing vow at 2,000, and then, you know, Grail Vow 3,000, 4,000, something like that. Because this is an inherent issue in the game. Campaigns are decided early on. So while Bretonnia can be good later on, it doesn't matter. You've won the campaign regardless by that point. And number 3, it is Slaanesh. Now, there are some issues that Slaanesh has that are more inherent problems to the game as a whole rather than Slaanesh in itself. But there are certainly some specific issues to Slaanesh. Namely, the issue of casualty replenishment. Having an army like Slaanesh, which is made up of a lot of glass cannon units, in particular if you don't own the Champions of Chaos DLC, well, that just creates a kind of situation where you can win a lot of battles, but you'll take a lot of casualties with these kind of units, and you don't have an easy way to replenish it, which pushes you in the direction of deciding, okay, let me get Champions of Chaos, let me get Chaos Warriors of Slaanesh, and that leads to a pretty boring playstyle. The reason that's particularly boring as a playstyle is because they are very durable. They will win a lot of battles, if not virtually every battle, but the problem you will encounter with that specific playstyle is that they will take quite a long time to actually kill things, which isn't great, because while you have cavalry that have devastating flanker like Chaos Knights of Slaanesh, actually using them in battle, especially with respect to field battles, is not great. That's another thing to mention about Slaanesh. We don't have any kind of siege equipment, which, given the number of siege battles, especially when Nakari starts in Wolf 1, where piles have some of the most formidable defensive settlements in the entire game. Most sieges, by the way, it's worth pointing out, most sieges have such a layout that you can abuse it in numerous ways as an attacker. But high-elven settlements are designed in such a way that abusing them is going to be difficult, because they're rigged to the brim with towers on every wall for the most part. Dark Elves are better, all that, but it is certainly an issue that Slaanesh does have at the moment. Lack of siege combined with poor casualty replenishment just leads to not so great of a playstyle. Better if you, like with Bretonnia, use a mod that removes siege battles in general and just replaces them with field battles or minor settlement battles even. But still a problem. Like, that's one of the inherent issues of the game. Sieges are not great in the game. And they're not great because of the way the AI works. They're not great because they take all the dynamic experience that you can have in a field battle and just push you in choke points and pushes you in a very cheesy playstyle. Because otherwise, you can lose sieges if you try and play, dynamically. If you try and play the maneuver warfare, you can certainly lose sieges. I mean, mind you, as Slaanesh, you will have to do that to some extent, and you can make it work, but you gotta be very careful about that kind of decision. Okay, so that's one problem. Outside of that, though, like on a campaign side, Slaanesh does have a pretty strong economy. Not necessarily because their buildings give you so much money, although they can go up to 600, and you can even buff that up, and you have, as well as pleasurable acts to also give you various other benefits. But no, the reason Slaanesh makes money is through subjugation. So with Slaanesh, you have various ways of subjugating factions. You have domination using cults or cultists once you fill up this bar, which can take time. So again, you end up in that situation where it's slow, or you can just like reduce a faction to their last element and then subjugate them. It's pretty gimmicky as a mechanic. That's probably more of an issue with the vassals in general, and that's something I would say really hurts Slaanesh the most. Though, on a bit of a side note, it's kind of hilarious that one of the things that Slaanesh does have access to as their first research, and I'm not joking on this, is a construction time -1 for provincial capital and settlement buildings. Just to understand, Slaanesh is not in a good spot as a race, and yet they have a research they can get from the beginning that makes them better than freaking Lizardmen. Also, hilariously enough, Slaanesh actually does have the ability of building settlements faster than the Lizardmen. Yeah, hilarity ensues, really. Hilarity freaking ensues in that. Though, to be fair, a lot of their research can certainly feel meaningless because, yeah, some of the stuff is just like, they do need a research update. They also need a hero update, special skill lines for heroes, all that. Sure, you have some stuff at the top, but again, they could use more uniqueness with heroes. Except the Warriors of Chaos stuff, like, basically Champions of Chaos and Warriors of Chaos are in a good spot, Slaanesh is not. And in general, one of the problems with demonic campaigns is the limitation on units, because of the way you recruit them. Like, consider Slaanesh. You have a barracks that goes up to tier 2 that gives you, Devoted Marauders and Forsaken. Okay, you use that until you get to tier 3, then you get this particular building, you get rid of this, get this building, you never look back. Why would you keep this building, right? So you end up actually with quite a few limitations in terms of recruitment, because like there's so many weird buildings. Like you could literally remove this entire building chain, remove this building chain, put it somewhere else, or attach all those units here, for instance, and it would not matter. Or maybe attach this building chain to this one. It would create more variety. Even so, there's a lot of fluff. So you end up in a situation like in every other demonic campaign, minus Nurgle to some extent because of the global recruitment benefits Nurgle has, but even Nurgle, it's a bit of a problem. You end up actually just restricting yourself in terms of the units. You basically want to go Forsaken of Slaanesh with Champions of Chaos, and then you're going to go with Chaos Warriors of Slaanesh, again, Champions of Chaos. And when a race requires a DLC to even be workable, like, forget the idea that it's better. We understand that. But when it requires a DLC to be workable, that is not a particularly great situation for a race. Also, fun stuff. Requiring a freaking control building, which you don't need as Slaanesh, far from it, because you get corruption, which means, like, yeah, screw control. Also, your main settlement building can also, or at least the provincial capital building, can give you control, so who gives a damn? But yeah, you can get it's the main settlement building, the provincial capital, that gives you control, so you'll never face rebellion. So you're literally just getting a building for cultists. They could cut down on the number of buildings, maybe they should. And you do have quite a few issues with vassals. Vassals, the inherent problem with vassals, yes, they're powerful. I'm not denying that. Obviously, it works. And the thing about Slaanesh, if you're willing to fight a lot of battles and minimize your casualties in those battles, you can dominate the map. Problem is, it's dull as dirt, because you have no control of your vassals. It's like herding cats. It's frustrating in that respect. But you'll never lose. Play this campaign as Nakari. Vassalize Ulfuan, get Alariel, Elfarian, Tyrion. You will never lose a campaign. Like, the entire Slaanesh campaign is fight Ulfuan. You do that once. You play that campaign once, twice. I've done it multiple times myself. It is fun doing that, because it is a genuine challenge, given the roster you have. And it is a challenge in perhaps the right way, minus the siege situation, replenishment problem. But actually, even at full strength, fighting Tyrion, Alariel, and Valerian can be very damn tricky. But once you do that, campaign is over. I think what Slaanesh could really benefit from, and even Warriors of Chaos, is the ability of recruiting units from the moment you vassalize a faction. Like, let's say, I vassalize Grace, maybe I should be able to recruit their units. Maybe I should be able to get Spearmen and Elven Archers. That would be an idea, right? Or maybe I should be able to fully control the vassal faction to a degree. They have their own income. That could be a very dynamic and interesting campaign where you're not just controlling your faction, you're controlling your vassals. I think that would be something that would make things a heck of a lot more interesting. Sure, they should give the option of allowing vassals to do their own things, just for newer players to be able to get the ropes. But if you want to, you should be able to fully control your vassals, their recruitment, their economy, and so on and so forth. It would make things so much more interesting. Of course, how they would handle that so you don't end up just basically playing a High Elf campaign as Slaanesh, that would be a different discussion. But I think that is the discussion that needs to happen with vassals, because it is something that affects the Warriors of Chaos, especially right now, not just Slaanesh. It just makes it really, really dull with respect to that. Like, there's factions that are better in terms of vassals, like Vampire Counts, but the reason Vampire Counts are better is because, one, they don't have subjugation, so they will have a more limited pool of vassals to get, and because Vampire Counts, for all their problems, and I would not necessarily call them problems, but for the lack of content more so, I would dare say that they can handle things on their own quite well. Economically speaking, militarily speaking, they do have options. They don't have siege, but still, they can work quite well. Like, their lords can solo freaking armies. Nakari ain't soloing shit. Skarbrand can solo entire legions of troops. I don't know how you would even kill Skarbrand. Like, how many troops it would require for the AI to even kill Skarbrand. Just putting that out there. As similar level to him, right? Not some, gold tier army when he's like level 10 or something like that. No, if he's level 50, what can even stop Skarbrand? Maybe Nakari should be just as dangerous as Skarbrand in that respect. Anyway, moving on. At number 2, it would be the Undead. And I'm not just talking about the Tomb Kings over here, I mean every single Undead race. So Tomb Kings, Vampire Counts, and Vampire Coast. For Vampire Coast, the principal issue beyond their army, which is one of their biggest problems, like they effectively don't have an army worth using, though the improvements in range units will benefit them, have benefited them, and you can make it work much better if you do use mods that remove siege battles and you're constantly fighting field battles, but even then, even with pure field battles, still a lot of issues with respect to them. But also, Vampire Coast was a testing ground for a lot of mechanics that were then taken by Creative Assembly and improved on. So they do need an update, a significant update in that respect. And also Sartosa should be far more unique than it is right now. For Tomb Kings, oh boy, the limited armies that you have for 14 freaking turns of your campaign, not great. The Canopic Jar situation where after every battle you can only earn up to 30. It doesn't matter what size of the army it is. It's always just going to be 30 freaking Canopic Jars. And the Books on a Gash. The Books on a Gash system, just throw it out the freaking door. Like, randomization of books, having one with one, just really not a good mechanic in general. And then Vampire Counts. Well, Vampire Counts do work quite well. They could use a unit with Wall Breaker, I would say, or several units with Wall Breakers. Like, there's things like Vargulfs, which should have Wall Breaker, but they don't. Maybe their lords should have it, at least when mounted on dragons. Maybe dragons in general should have Wall Breaker. But beyond that particular aspect, those kind of problems in battle because of the limitation of sieges, which is more of an inherent issue with sieges in the game as a whole, the issue with the Vampire Counts comes down to the fact that while they are perfectly fine functional race that does work, could use some retouching on settlements, structures, etc., but not really a rework, more so just like, hey, let's give people more heroes, let's give them an extra economic building, that kind of stuff, right? Or a different tier of an economic building, all that. But Vampire Counts do work. What I would say they could really use is more units, more uniqueness to each campaign. Manfred's campaign is not great. Vlad and Isabella do work quite well, but there's not enough differentiation or any differentiation between Vlad, Isabella, Manfred, Gorst, and Kemler. And there should be, like, Gorst and Kemler should focus on necromancy, Vlad should focus on, the blood kisses, and Manfred, yeah, he can focus on the Books and the Gash if that system actually is improved. It would be interesting if you're playing a Manfred campaign and your goal would be to bring back Nagash and then you would gain Nagash. But I guess that depends on how Creative Assembly is going to handle Nagash, which, whether you want to believe it or not, I think it's fairly likely that he will be coming in a campaign. Also, yeah, rights for, Tomb Kings. There's not really a whole lot to say on this. Like, the thing about Tomb Kings and the Vampire Counts is that they both work, but certainly Tomb Kings have a lot of issues in that early game stretch. Vampire Counts don't, but they have other issues in their respective campaigns. So I think that's something Creative Assembly can improve. Though I'm curious to try and play a Tomb King campaign where I'm using mods to really speed up the pace and how that particular playstyle will be. We'll see about that. And then we will get to number 1. But first off, some honorable mentions, because there are some that do warrant mention from my perspective. In terms of honorable mentions, well, one could argue the Beastmen. The reason I'd say the Beastmen is, like, basically Tarax is carrying the entire race right now, and based on community polling, it's very clear that people only care about playing Tarax's campaign. So really the other Beastmen campaigns could use more uniqueness, and they could really use an easier way of getting extra army capacity from the start. It made sense in Warhammer 2 because of the slower playstyle there, where even maintaining a second army because of supply lines was tricky, so it wasn't as much of a problem, but it is a problem in the context of Warhammer 3. So some updates with Dread, some updates in terms of unit capacity, maybe increasing baseline unit capacity from 1 to 2 for special units. That could help them out and just really make them better to play, especially early on. But that's just a mention I would like to give. But really the races I think do need a rework are things like Kislev, Siege, and Cafe. Basically the Shadows of Change races. We know Cafe is going to come out, so hopefully they will get some updates on that. Obviously Ogres, Greenskins, and Khorne are coming out. Kislev supporter race needs to be completely overhauled. Boris needs to be more unique. Astankia needs to have less of a miserable campaign. And with Siege, you either have a miserable campaign as Pyros or a really powerful but dull as dirt campaign for the change. I know it's probably not going to be a priority for Creative Assembly considering the fact that they just reworked, they didn't rework shit. That they just released the DLC for those races with SOC, but I think the numbers speak for themselves. People did not like SOC. It's not just about units. Some people tend to think like, oh, the units are important. No, it's mechanics of these races. So Kislev needs better mechanics. Siege needs better mechanics. Even Cafe needs better mechanics, because Cafe is powerful. Even Kislev is powerful. Like, all three races can be very powerful. It's just like, it's not a particularly great playstyle for any of them. Certainly nowhere near on the same level as some of the other races on this list, but I do think it's worth mentioning that yes, they do need that. Outside of that, which other races would I prioritize? Well, here's one thing I will say. I think like some people are saying, oh, this race is fine, this race is fine. My perspective on that is Creative Assembly can always improve it. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't priorities. There should be priorities. But, like, you know, you look at Wood Elves, right? Powerful race, really functional, really iconic to their playstyle, dull as dirt to actually play. So I think, like, CA should really continuously improve the game and really put a lot more effort with that. Now, they've said that they will. We'll have to wait and see. Based on what I've heard, and make of this what you will, the backlash that they got over the leaks with Cafe has really changed things in the company. I mean, things are already moving in a positive direction, but I think they were still wondering if, okay, we released Fronts Decay, but can we get away with less? Answer is, CA, you can't. If you try and go back to what you did before, or release a Lord pack, which SOC was with no substantial improvements in the game, people are going to tear it to shreds. Maybe a couple of years from now, once you've released another game that does well, maybe. But right now, for the next couple of years, you need to do better. You need to prove that you do better. But anyway, this brings us to the number one choice from both the community and really for myself. Well, for myself, it's obviously Ogres. I would really like them to be improved, but we know they're going to be improved. So we finally get to Norsca, the worst race in the game for which Creative Assembly has not revealed that they're going to do a DLC. They've talked about monster hunts in a recent video on the subject of the Rivers of Blood DLC or whatever title it's going to have, but suffice to say, Norsca is in a bad state. Because to understand the issue in Norsca, they're not a Warhammer 2 race in Warhammer 3. They're a Warhammer 1 race in Warhammer 3. And that is really the root cause of a lot of their issues. And in point of fact, Creative Assembly made it worse by nerfing their economy on land from double, from 100 to 200, 300 to 50, 100, 100 and 150. That is really horrible. Genuinely horrible. Ogres do have it worse because Norsca at least does get ports, but geez, CA, you really had to go there. So that is not great. On top of that, on top of having a bad economy, let's talk about having an army that is very glass with little cannons until much later on in their campaign. So they take a lot of damage in battles, especially with their early game units. Think of Marauders, Berserkers, etc. But they have a poor casualty replenishment situation until they get to tier 4. If you play Tron, you do start with a hero casualty replenishment, but that's just one hero. And one hero does not make a campaign. That is the problem. And unlike High Elves, who do struggle getting a lot of heroes, they at least have an army that can take few casualties in battle, and besides they have a right that helps with that. You can argue, well, you can always go for Nurgle. Yeah, this meter up here is not ideal either. But that's certainly an issue. Limited unit roster, check. Situation, slow growth, check. I mean, it's not horrible growth, but limited money as well as their settlement dynamic, because this is where really things suck. But beyond that, there's also, of course, the research tree that is pretty bloody worthless in a significant number of ways. Oh yeah, let me go all the way to Black Crag. Jeez, I don't know what CA was thinking with that. They really do need to revamp these systems. But let's consider settlement. Because you have poor income, when you take a settlement, what you want to do really is sack it first and then occupy it. Now this is not horrible, greenskins do it all the time, it works for them. The issue is that you also want to get allegiance to the gods, which requires raising the settlement, and it does give you allegiance, but it doesn't give you anything else beyond that. So I think like if you gain some money, that would be better. In the best case scenario, and the problem with raising a settlement like Norsca, you don't get movement range after raising a settlement. So unlike say Beastmen, unlike say Khorne, who can just, you know, resell a settlement after they've raised it, you don't have that luxury. Unless something like this happens where your lord doesn't move from the settlement after you've raised it. But this only works in certain situations, like it works on the island over here because of the pathfinding. It may work in mountains, but it doesn't work in a lot of cases. So you're in a situation where you want to sack settlements one turn, wait another turn to raise it, and then wait another turn potentially to occupy it, because you do need to occupy it as well. That, unless you get lucky like this. That is genuinely one of the worst faction dynamics in the fricking game. And you need to do this, like, you can't just skip on this. You might say, oh, I could skip the bonuses. No, you need to, like, get level 2 and level 3 allegiance with one of the gods. You can rely on monster hunts for that. People would say, oh yeah, let's talk about the monster hunts. At least you don't deal with rebellions all often because of chaos corruption, but geez. Let's talk about that. Monster hunts. Go to the book, fight exceptionally difficult battles, like this Igor can wipe out their entire army. This Frostrake can wipe out their entire army. They're incredibly difficult battles. Even if you unlock them a bit later on. Sure, if you bring a bunch of Marauder champions and trolls and all that, it will be easier, but still you take a truckload of damage in that. So maybe they should be a bit rebalanced. Now, I'm not saying they should be easy. In fact, one of my problems with a lot of quest battles is that they're too freaking easy. But maybe CA should rebalance some of them, make some harder, a lot of them harder, but some easier. Like Norsca has genuinely some of the hardest quest battles in the fucking game. It's not an especially rewarding situation, I gotta tell you, with respect to that. It's a gimmicky system. Like, in a Fury, this could be great, right? You do objectives like Malachi, you have a great quest battle at the end. But unlike Malachi, who just basically is like, oh, you get these units, play with them, use them, and do a couple of other objectives that are very easy to do and not frustrating at all. Sure, you might have to travel to certain regions, but you'll do so anyway, right? In many cases. Or if you have to go out of your way, it's not really too much of a problem. But let's consider Norsca. Consider the Monster Hunt Island. Go to freaking Frozen Landing. I grant you, I started this as, like, I could have done this at Strahd, it would have been a lot easier. But go to freaking Frozen Landing, and then you get a series of quests to do it. It's like the same freaking quest system from previous games that was abandoned in Warhammer 3 for good bloody reason, because it was always horrible. There are mods that fix it, but geez, that is terrible. So you have limited economy, you have bad campaign systems, you have a limited unit roster, you only have one lord choice, you have a lord option that doesn't even have a melee skill line. It is that bad with Norsca. Like, seriously, don't play this faction. It is that broken. Like, even with mods, like, it takes... Maybe some reworks can fix it, but I don't know if I'd even play with something like Radius or SFO, to be honest with you. Norsca is just in a bad situation. They really desperately need better mechanics. And hopefully they will get them. Because everything that's broken about the game, every single worst aspect, from sieges to lacking units that are effective in sieges, because you don't have siege equipment. That's another problem. It's like, you know, imagine a giant fucking woolly mammoth not having wall breaker. as an example. You don't have a good situation in sieges. You don't have good campaign mechanics. You don't have a good battle dynamic. You don't have anything working for you. And don't even get me started on the fact that Wulfric should have a teleportation mechanic around the world, because that's his whole thing. Well, basically the ship he has a figurine that allows for that teleportation. And it is the kind of thing that could work with an entire army or multiple armies, because that's actually something about him in the lore. Like, he actually at one point teleported with an entire fleet of longships and then screwed them over because chaos is chaos. But still, not a great situation for Norsca over there. And maybe there's an argument to be made that Norsca shouldn't have been its own race. That's a different discussion. But still, like, yeah, just not a great situation at all. Some of the worst aspects, very few of the good. There are some cool monsters, but good luck affording them. Costin signing out. Stay tuned for more, and let me know what you guys think about all of this, or what races would you like to see reworked. I do think like High Elves, Dark Elves do need that, Wood Elves as well. Vassalization needs to be changed, sieges need to be changed, campaign pacing needs to be changed, all that kind of stuff. See you next time.